Book 6, Chapter 3 of Coningsby or the New Generation by Benjamin Disraeli. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3 The image of Edith Millbank was the last thought of Coningsby as he sank into an agitated slumber. To him had hitherto in general been accorded the precious boon of dreamless sleep. Homer tells us these phantasms come from Jove. They are rather the children of a distracted soul. Coningsby this night lived much in past years, varied by painful perplexities of the present which he could neither subdue nor comprehend. The scene flitted from Eton to the castle of his grandfather, and then he found himself among the pictures of the Rue de Tronchet, but their owner bore the features of the senior Millbank. A beautiful countenance that was alternately the face in the mysterious picture, and then that of Edith, haunted him under all circumstances. He woke little refreshed, restless, and yet sensible of some secret joy. He woke to think of her of whom he had dreamed. The light had dawned on his soul. Coningsby loved. Ah, what is that ambition that haunts our youth, that thirst for power or that lust for fame, that forces us from obscurity into the sun blaze of the world? What are these sentiments so high, so vehement, so ennobling? They vanish, and in an instant, before the glance of a woman. Coningsby had scarcely quitted her side the preceding eve. He hung upon the accents of that clear sweet voice, and sought with tremulous fascination the gleaming splendour of those soft dark eyes. And now he sat in his chamber, with his eyes fixed on vacancy. All thoughts and feelings, pursuits, desires, life, merge in one absorbing sentiment. It is impossible to exist without seeing her again, and instantly. He had requested and gained permission to call on Lady Wallinger. He would not lose a moment in availing himself of it. As early as was tolerably decorous, and before in all probability they could quit their hotel, Coningsby repaired to the Rue de Rivoli to pay his respects to his new friends. As he walked along he indulged in fanciful speculations which connected Edith and the mysterious portrait of his mother. He felt himself, as it were, near the fulfilment of some fate, and on the threshold of some critical discovery. He recalled the impatient, even alarmed expressions of Rigby at Montem 6 years ago, when he proposed to invite young Millbank to his grandfather's dinner. The vindictive feud that existed between the two families, and for which political opinion, or even party passion, could not satisfactorily account; and he reasoned himself into a conviction that the solution of many perplexities was at hand, and that all would be consummated to the satisfaction of every one by his unexpected but inevitable agency. Coningsby found Sir Joseph alone. The worthy baronet was at any rate no participator in Mr. Millbank's vindictive feelings against Lord Monmouth. On the contrary, he had a very high respect for a marquess, whatever might be his opinions, and no mean consideration for a marquess's grandson. Sir Joseph had inherited a large fortune made by commerce, and had increased it by the same means. He was a middle class Whig, had faithfully supported the party in his native town during the days they wandered in the wilderness, and had well earned his share of the milk and honey when they had vanquished the promised land. In the springtide of liberalism, when the world was not analytical of free opinions, and odious distinctions were not drawn between finality men and progressive reformers, Mr. Wallinger had been the popular leader of a powerful body of his fellow citizens who had returned him to the first reformed Parliament, and where, in spite of many a menacing registration, he had contrived to remain. He had never given a radical vote without the permission of the Secretary of the Treasury, and was not afraid of giving an unpopular one to serve his friends. He was not like that distinguished Liberal who, after dining with the late Whig Premier, expressed his gratification and his gratitude by assuring his Lordship that he might count on his support on all popular questions. "I want men who will support the government on all unpopular questions," replied the witty statesman. Mr. Wallinger was one of these men. His high character and strong purse were always in the front rank in the hour of danger. His support in the House was limited to his votes, but in other places equally important, at a meeting of a political club, or in Downing Street, he could find his tongue, take what is called a practical view of a question, adopt what is called an independent tone, reanimate confidence in ministers, check mutiny, and set a bright and bold example to the wavering. A man of his property, and high character, and sound views, so practical and so independent, this was evidently the block from which a baronet should be cut, and in due time he figured Sir Joseph. A Spanish gentleman of ample means, and of a good Catalan family, flying during a political convulsion in England, arrived with his two daughters at Liverpool, and bore letters of introduction to the house of Wallinger. Some little time after this, by one of those stormy vicissitudes of political fortune, of late years not unusual in the Peninsula, he returned to his native country, and left his children, and the management of that portion of his fortune that he had succeeded in bringing with him, under the guardianship of the father of the present Sir Joseph. This gentleman was about again to become an exile, when he met with an untimely end in one of those terrible tumults of which Barcelona is the frequent scene. The younger Wallinger was touched by the charms of one of his father's wards. Her beauty of a character to which he was unaccustomed, her accomplishments of society, and the refinement of her manners, conspicuous in the circle in which he lived, captivated him; and though they had no heir, the union had been one of great felicity. Sir Joseph was proud of his wife. He secretly considered himself, though his tone was as liberal and independent as in old days, to be on the threshold of aristocracy, and was conscious that Lady Wallinger played her part not unworthily in the elevated circles in which they now frequently found themselves. Sir Joseph was fond of great people, and not averse to travel; because, bearing a title and being a member of the British Parliament, and always moving with the appendages of wealth, servants, carriages, and couriers, and fortified with no lack of letters from the Foreign Office, he was everywhere acknowledged and received, and treated as a personage; was invited to court balls, dined with ambassadors, and found himself and his lady at every festival of distinction. The elder Millbank had been Joseph Wallinger's youthful friend. Different as were their dispositions and the rate of their abilities, their political opinions were the same, and commerce habitually connected their interests. During a visit to Liverpool, Millbank had made the acquaintance of the sister of Lady Wallinger, and had been a successful suitor for her hand. This lady was the mother of Edith and of the schoolfellow of Coningsby. It was only within a very few years that she had died. She had scarcely lived long enough to complete the education of her daughter, to whom she was devoted, and on whom she lavished the many accomplishments that she possessed. Lady Wallinger, having no children, and being very fond of her niece, had watched over Edith with infinite solicitude, and finally had persuaded Mr. Millbank that it would be well that his daughter should accompany them in their somewhat extensive travels. It was not, therefore, only that nature had developed a beautiful woman out of a bashful girl since Coningsby's visit to Millbank, but really every means and every opportunity that could contribute to render an individual capable of adorning the most accomplished circles of life, had naturally and without effort fallen to the fortunate lot of the manufacturer's daughter. Edith possessed an intelligence equal to those occasions. Without losing the native simplicity of her character, which sprang from the heart, and which the strong and original bent of her father's mind had fostered, she had imbibed all the refinement and facility of the polished circles in which she moved. She had a clear head, a fine taste, and a generous spirit; had received so much admiration, that though by no means insensible to homage, her heart was free; was strongly attached to her family, and notwithstanding all the splendour of Rome and the brilliancy of Paris, her thoughts were often in her Saxon valley, amid the green hills and busy factories of Millbank. Sir Joseph, finding himself alone with the grandson of Lord Monmouth, was not very anxious that the ladies should immediately appear. He thought this a good opportunity of getting at what are called the real feelings of the Tory party, and he began to pump with a seductive semblance of frankness. For his part, he had never doubted that a Conservative government was ultimately inevitable; had told Lord John so 2 years ago; and between themselves Lord John was of the same opinion. The present position of the Whigs was the necessary fate of all progressive parties; could not see exactly how it would end; thought sometimes it must end in a fusion of parties, but could not well see how that could be brought about, at least at present. For his part, should be happy to witness a union of the best men of all parties for the preservation of peace and order, without any reference to particular opinions; and in that sense of the word, it was not at all impossible that he might find it his duty some day to support a Conservative government. Sir Joseph was much astonished when Coningsby, who, being somewhat impatient for the entrance of the ladies, was rather more abrupt than was his wont, told the worthy baronet that he looked upon a government without distinct principles of policy as only a stop-gap to a wide-spread and demoralising anarchy; that he, for one, could not comprehend how a free government could endure without national opinions to uphold it; and that governments for the preservation of peace and order, and nothing else, had better be sought in China, or among the Austrians, the Chinese of Europe. As for Conservative government, the natural question was, what do you mean to conserve? Do you mean to conserve things, or only names, realities, or merely appearances? Or do you mean to continue the system commenced in 1834, and with a hypocritical reverence for the principles, and a superstitious adhesion to the forms, of the old exclusive constitution, carry on your policy by latitudinarian practice? Sir Joseph stared. It was the first time that any inkling of the views of the new generation had caught his ear. They were strange and unaccustomed accents. He was extremely perplexed; could by no means make out what his companion was driving at. At length, with a rather knowing smile, expressive as much of compassion as comprehension, he remarked, 'Ah, I see, you are a regular Orangeman.' 'I look upon an Orangeman,' said Coningsby, 'as a pure Whig, the only professor and practiser of unadulterated Whiggism.' This was too much for Sir Joseph, whose political knowledge did not reach much further back than the ministry of the Mediocrities, hardly touched the times of the Corresponding Society; but he was a cautious man, and never replied in haste. He was about feeling his way, when he experienced the golden advantage of gaining time, for the ladies entered. The heart of Coningsby throbbed as Edith appeared. She extended to him her hand, her face radiant with kind expression. Lady Wallinger seemed gratified also by his visit. She had much elegance in her manner, a calm soft address, and she spoke English with a sweet Doric irregularity. They all sat down, talked of the last night's ball, of 1,000 things. There was something animating in the frank, cheerful spirit of Edith. She had a quick eye both for the beautiful and the ridiculous, and threw out her observations in terse and vivid phrases. An hour, and more than an hour, passed away, and Coningsby still found some excuse not to depart. It seemed that on this morning they were about to make an expedition into the antique city of Paris, to visit some old hotels which retained their character; especially they had heard much of the hotel of the Archbishop of Sens, with its fortified courtyard. Coningsby expressed great interest in the subject, and showed some knowledge. Sir Joseph invited him to join the party, which of all things in the world was what he most desired. Chapter 4. Not a day elapsed without Coningsby being in the company of Edith. Time was precious for him, for the spires and pinnacles of Cambridge already began to loom in the distance, and he resolved to make the most determined efforts not to lose a day of his liberty. And yet to call every morning in the Rue de Rivoli was an exploit which surpassed even the audacity of love. More than once, making the attempt, his courage failed him, and he turned into the gardens of the Tuileries, and only watched the windows of the house. Circumstances, however, favoured him. He received a letter from Oswald Millbank. He was bound to communicate in person this evidence of his friend's existence, and when he had to reply to the letter, he must necessarily inquire whether his friend's relatives had any message to transmit to him. These, however, were only slight advantages. What assisted Coningsby in his plans and wishes was the great pleasure which Sidonia, with whom he passed a great deal of his time, took in the society of the Wallingers and their niece. Sidonia presented Lady Wallinger with his opera box during her stay at Paris, invited them frequently to his agreeable dinner parties, and announced his determination to give a ball, which Lady Wallinger esteemed a delicate attention to Edith, while Lady Monmouth flattered herself that the festival sprang from the desire she had expressed of seeing the celebrated hotel of Sidonia to advantage. Coningsby was very happy. His morning visits to the Rue de Rivoli seemed always welcome, and seldom an evening elapsed in which he did not find himself in the society of Edith. She seemed not to wish to conceal that his presence gave her pleasure, and although she had many admirers, and had an airy graciousness for all of them, Coningsby sometimes indulged the exquisite suspicion that there was a flattering distinction in her carriage to himself. Under the influence of these feelings, he began daily to be more conscious that separation would be an intolerable calamity. He began to meditate upon the feasibility of keeping half a term, and of postponing his departure to Cambridge to a period nearer the time when Edith would probably return to England. In the meanwhile, the Parisian world talked much of the grand fete which was about to be given by Sidonia. Coningsby heard much of it one day when dining at his grandfather's. Lady Monmouth seemed very intent on the occasion. Even Lord Monmouth half talked of going, though for his part he wished people would come to him, and never ask him to their houses. That was his idea of society. He liked the world, but he liked to find it under his own roof. He grudged them nothing, so that they would not insist upon the reciprocity of cold catching, and would eat his good dinners instead of insisting on his eating their bad ones. 'But Monsieur Sidonia's cook is a gem, they say,' observed an attaché of an embassy. 'I have no doubt of it. Sidonia is a man of sense, almost the only man of sense I know. I never caught him tripping. He never makes a false move. Sidonia is exactly the sort of man I like. You know you cannot deceive him, and that he does not want to deceive you. I wish he liked a rubber more. Then he would be perfect.' 'They say he is going to be married,' said the attaché. 'Pooh!' said Lord Monmouth. 'Married!' exclaimed Lady Monmouth. 'To whom?' 'To your beautiful countrywoman, la belle Anglaise, that all the world talks of,' said the attaché. 'And who may she be, pray?' said the Marquess. 'I have so many beautiful countrywomen.' 'Mademoiselle Millbank,' said the attaché. 'Millbank!' said the Marquess, with a lowering brow. 'There are so many Millbanks. Do you know what Millbank this is, Harry?' he inquired of his grandson, who had listened to the conversation with rather an embarrassed and even agitated spirit. 'What, sir? Yes, Millbank?' said Coningsby. 'I say, do you know who this Millbank is?' 'Oh, Miss Millbank! Yes, I believe. That is, I know a daughter of the gentleman who purchased some property near you.' 'Oh, that fellow! Has he got a daughter here?' 'The most beautiful girl in Paris,' said the attaché. 'Lady Monmouth, have you seen this beauty that Sidonia is going to marry?' he added, with a fiendish laugh. 'I have seen the young lady,' said Lady Monmouth, 'but I had not heard that Monsieur Sidonia was about to marry her.' 'Is she so very beautiful?' inquired another gentleman. "Yes," said Lady Monmouth, calm but pale. "Pooh!" said the Marquess again. "I assure you that it is a fact," said the attaché, "not at least an on dit. I have it from a quarter that could not well be mistaken." Behold a little snatch of ordinary dinner gossip that left a very painful impression on the minds of three individuals who were present. The name of Millbank revived in Lord Monmouth's mind a sense of defeat, discomfiture, and disgust. Hellingsley, lost elections, and Mr. Rigby, three subjects which Lord Monmouth had succeeded for a time in expelling from his sensations. His Lordship thought that, in all probability, this beauty of whom they spoke so highly was not really the daughter of his foe, that it was some confusion which had arisen from the similarity of names. Nor did he believe that Sidonia was going to marry her, whoever she might be. But a variety of things had been said at dinner, and a number of images had been raised in his mind that touched his spleen. He took his wine freely, and, the usual consequence of that proceeding with Lord Monmouth, became silent and sullen. As for Lady Monmouth, she had learned that Sidonia, whatever might be the result, was paying very marked attention to another woman, for whom undoubtedly he was giving that very ball which she had flattered herself was a homage to her wishes, and for which she had projected a new dress of eclipsing splendour. Coningsby felt quite sure that the story of Sidonia's marriage with Edith was the most ridiculous idea that ever entered into the imagination of man. At least he thought he felt quite sure. But the idlest and wildest report that the woman you love is about to marry another is not comfortable. Besides, he could not conceal from himself that between the Wallingers and Sidonia there existed a remarkable intimacy, fully extended to their niece. He had seen her certainly on more than one occasion in lengthened and apparently earnest conversation with Sidonia, who, by the bye, spoke with her often in Spanish, and never concealed his admiration of her charms or the interest he found in her society. And Edith, what after all had passed between Edith and himself which should at all gainsay this report, which he had been particularly assured was not a mere report, but came from a quarter that could not well be mistaken? She had received him with kindness. And how should she receive one who was the friend and preserver of her only brother, and apparently the intimate and cherished acquaintance of her future husband? Coningsby felt that sickness of the heart that accompanies one's first misfortune. The illusions of life seemed to dissipate and disappear. He was miserable. He had no confidence in himself, in his future. After all, what was he? A dependent on a man of very resolute will and passions. Could he forget the glance with which Lord Monmouth caught the name of Millbank, and received the intimation of Hellingsley? It was a glance for a Spagnoletto or a Caravaggio to catch and immortalise. Why, if Edith were not going to marry Sidonia, how was he ever to marry her, even if she cared for him? Oh, what a future of unbroken, continuous, interminable misery awaited him! Was there ever yet born a being with a destiny so dark and dismal? He was the most forlorn of men, utterly wretched. He had entirely mistaken his own character. He had no energy, no abilities, not a single eminent quality. All was over. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5. It was fated that Lady Monmouth should not be present at that ball, the anticipation of which had occasioned her so much pleasure and some pangs. On the morning after that slight conversation which had so disturbed the souls, though unconsciously to each other, of herself and Coningsby, the Marquess was driving Lucretia up the Avenue Marigny in his phaeton. About the centre of the avenue the horses took fright, and started off at a wild pace. The Marquess was an experienced whip, calm, and with exertion still very powerful. He would have soon mastered the horses, had not one of the reins unhappily broken. The horses swerved. The Marquess kept his seat. Lucretia, alarmed, sprang up, The carriage was dashed against the trunk of a tree, and she was thrown out of it at the very instant that one of the outriders had succeeded in heading the equipage and checking the horses. The Marchioness was senseless. Lord Monmouth had descended from the phaeton. Several passengers had assembled. The door of a contiguous house was opened. There were offers of service, sympathy, inquiries, a babel of tongues, great confusion. 'Get surgeons and send for her maid,' said Lord Monmouth to one of the servants. In the midst of this distressing tumult, Sidonia, on horseback, followed by a groom, came up the avenue from the Champs Elysees. The empty phaeton, reins broken, horses held by strangers, all the appearances of a misadventure, attracted him. He recognised the livery. He instantly dismounted. Moving aside the crowd, he perceived Lady Monmouth senseless and prostrate, and her husband without assistance, restraining the injudicious efforts of the bystanders. 'Let us carry her in, Lord Monmouth,' said Sidonia, exchanging a recognition as he took Lucretia in his arms, and bore her into the dwelling that was at hand. Those who were standing at the door assisted him. The woman of the house and Lord Monmouth only were present. 'I would hope there is no fracture,' said Sidonia, placing her on a sofa; 'nor does it appear to me that the percussion of the head, though considerable, could have been fatally violent. I have caught her pulse. Keep her in a horizontal position, and she will soon come to herself.' The Marquess seated himself in a chair by the side of the sofa, which Sidonia had advanced to the middle of the room. Lord Monmouth was silent and very serious. Sidonia opened the window, and touched the brow of Lucretia with water. At this moment Monsieur Villebecque and a surgeon entered the chamber. 'The brain cannot be affected with that pulse,' said the surgeon. 'There is no fracture.' 'How pale she is!' said Lord Monmouth, as if he were examining a picture. 'The colour seems to me to return,' said Sidonia. The surgeon applied some restoratives, which he had brought with him. The face of the Marchioness showed signs of life. She stirred. 'She revives,' said the surgeon. The Marchioness breathed with some force again, then half opened her eyes, and then instantly closed them. 'If I could but get her to take this draught,' said the surgeon. 'Stop, moisten her lips first,' said Sidonia. They placed the draught to her mouth. In a moment she put forth her hand as if to repress them, then opened her eyes again and sighed. 'She is herself,' said the surgeon. 'Lucretia!' said the Marquess. 'Sidonia!' said the Marchioness. Lord Monmouth looked round to invite his friend to come forward. 'Lady Monmouth,' said Sidonia, in a gentle voice. She started, rose a little on the sofa, stared around her. 'Where am I?' she exclaimed. 'With me,' said the Marquess, and he bent forward to her and took her hand. 'Sidonia?' she again exclaimed, in a voice of inquiry. 'Is here,' said Lord Monmouth. 'He carried you in after our accident.' 'Accident! Why is he going to marry?' The Marquess took a pinch of snuff. There was an awkward pause in the chamber. 'I think now,' said Sidonia to the surgeon, 'that Lady Monmouth would take the draught.' She refused it. 'Try you, Sidonia,' said the Marquess rather drily. 'You feel yourself again?' said Sidonia, advancing. 'Would I did not!' said the Marchioness, with an air of stupor. 'What has happened? Why am I here? Are you married?' 'She wanders a little,' said Sidonia. The Marquess took another pinch of snuff. 'I could have borne even repulsion,' said Lady Monmouth, in a voice of desolation, 'but not for another.' 'Monsieur Villebecque?' said the Marquess. 'My lord?' Lord Monmouth looked at him with that irresistible scrutiny which would daunt a galley slave; and then, after a short pause, said, 'The carriage should have arrived by this time. Let us get home.' Chapter 6. After the conversation at dinner which we have noticed, the restless and disquieted Coningsby wandered about Paris, vainly seeking in the distraction of a great city some relief from the excitement of his mind. His first resolution was immediately to depart for England, But when, on reflection, he was mindful that, after all, the assertion which had so agitated him might really be without foundation, in spite of many circumstances that to his regardful fancy seemed to accredit it, his firm resolution began to waver. These were the first pangs of jealousy that Coningsby had ever experienced, and they revealed to him the immensity of the stake which he was hazarding on a most uncertain die. The next morning he called in the Rue Rivoli, and was informed that the family were not at home. He was returning under the arcades towards the Rue Saint Florentin, when Sidonia passed him in an opposite direction, on horseback and at a rapid rate. Coningsby, who was not observed by him, could not resist a strange temptation to watch for a moment his progress. He saw him enter the court of the hotel where the Wallinger family was staying. Would he come forth immediately? No. Coningsby stood still and pale. Minute followed minute. Coningsby flattered himself that Sidonia was only speaking to the porter. Then he would fain believe Sidonia was writing a note. Then, crossing the street, he mounted by some steps the terrace of the Tuileries, nearly opposite the hotel of the Minister of Finance, and watched the house. A quarter of an hour elapsed. Sidonia did not come forth. They were at home to him, only to him. Sick at heart, infinitely wretched, scarcely able to guide his steps, dreading even to meet an acquaintance, and almost feeling that his tongue would refuse the office of conversation, he contrived to meet his grandfather's hotel, and was about to bury himself in his chamber, when on the staircase he met Flora. Coningsby had not seen her for the last fortnight. Seeing her now, his heart smote him for his neglect, excusable as it really was. Any one else at this time he would have hurried by without a recognition; but the gentle and suffering Flora was too meek to be rudely treated by so kind a heart as Coningsby's. He looked at her; she was pale and agitated; her step trembled, while she still hastened on. 'What is the matter?' inquired Coningsby. 'My lord, the Marchioness are in danger, thrown from their carriage.' Briefly she detailed to Coningsby all that had occurred; that Monsieur Villebecque had already repaired to them; that she herself only this moment had learned the intelligence that seemed to agitate her to the centre. Coningsby instantly turned with her; but they had scarcely emerged from the courtyard when the carriage approached that brought Lord and Lady Monmouth home. They followed it into the court. They were immediately at its door. 'All is right, Harry,' said the Marquess, calm and grave. Coningsby pressed his grandfather's hand. Then he assisted Lucretia to alight. 'I am quite well,' she said, 'now.' 'But you must lean on me, dearest Lady Monmouth,' Coningsby said in a tone of tenderness, as he felt Lucretia almost sinking from him; and he supported her into the hall of the hotel. Lord Monmouth had lingered behind. Flora crept up to him, and with unwonted boldness offered her arm to the Marquess. He looked at her with a glance of surprise, and then a softer expression, one indeed of an almost winning sweetness, which, though rare, was not a stranger to his countenance, melted his features, and taking the arm so humbly presented, he said, 'Ma petite, you look more frightened than any of us. Poor child!' He had reached the top of the flight of steps. He withdrew his arm from Flora, and thanked her with all his courtesy. 'You are not hurt then, sir?' she ventured to ask with a look that expressed the infinite solicitude which her tongue did not venture to convey. 'By no means, my good little girl;' and he extended his hand to her, which she reverently bent over and embraced. Chapter 7. When Coningsby had returned to his grandfather's hotel that morning, it was with the determination to leave Paris the next day for England. But the accident to Lady Monmouth, though, as it ultimately appeared, accompanied by no very serious consequences, quite dissipated this intention. It was impossible to quit them so crudely at such a moment. So he remained another day, and that was the day preceding Sidonia's fête, which he particularly resolved not to attend. He felt it quite impossible that he could again endure the sight of either Sidonia or Edith. He looked upon them as persons who had deeply injured him. though they were really individuals who had treated him with invariable kindness. But he felt their existence was a source of mortification and misery to him. With these feelings, sauntering away the last hours at Paris, disquieted, uneasy, no present, no future, no enjoyment, no hope, really, positively, undeniably unhappy. Unhappy, too, for the first time in his life. The first unhappiness, what a companion piece for the first love! Coningsby, of all places in the world, in the gardens of the Luxembourg, encountered Sir Joseph Wallinger and Edith. To avoid them was impossible. They met face to face, and Sir Joseph stopped and immediately reminded him that it was 3 days since they had seen him, as if to reproach him for so unprecedented a neglect. And it seemed that Edith, though she said not as much, felt the same. And Coningsby turned round and walked with them. He told them he was going to leave Paris on the morrow. 'And Monsieur de Sidonia's fate, of which we have all talked so much?' said Edith, with unaffected surprise, and an expression of disappointment which she in vain attempted to conceal. 'The festival will not be less gay for my absence,' said Coningsby, with that plaintive moroseness not unusual to despairing lovers. 'If we were all to argue from the same premises, and act accordingly,' said Edith, 'the saloons would be empty. But if any person's absence would be remarked, I should really have thought it would be yours. I thought you were one of Monsieur de Sidonia's great friends?' 'He has no friends,' said Coningsby. 'No wise man has. What are friends? Traitors.' Edith looked much astonished, and then she said, 'I am sure you have not quarrelled with Monsieur de Sidonia, for we have just parted with him.' 'I have no doubt you have,' thought Coningsby. 'And it is impossible to speak of another in higher terms than he spoke of you.' Sir Joseph observed how unusual it was for Monsieur de Sidonia to express himself so warmly. 'Sidonia is a great man, and carries everything before him,' said Coningsby. 'I am nothing. I cannot cope with him. I retire from the field.' 'What field?' inquired Sir Joseph, who did not clearly catch the drift of these observations. 'It appears to me that a field for action is exactly what Sidonia wants. There is no vent for his abilities and intelligence. He wastes his energy in travelling from capital to capital like a king's messenger. The morning after his fête he is going to Madrid.' This brought some reference to their mutual movements. Edith spoke of a return to Lancashire, of her hope that Mr. Coningsby would soon see Oswald; but Mr. Coningsby informed her that though he was going to leave Paris, he had no intention of returning to England; that he had not yet quite made up his mind whither he should go, but thought that he should travel directly to St. Petersburg. He wished to travel overland to Astrakhan. That was the place he was particularly anxious to visit. After this incomprehensible announcement, they walked on for some minutes in silence, broken only by occasional monosyllables, with which Coningsby responded at hazard to the sound remarks of Sir Joseph. As they approached the palace, a party of English who were visiting the Chamber of Peers, and who were acquainted with the companions of Coningsby, encountered them. Amid the mutual recognitions, Coningsby was about to take his leave somewhat ceremoniously, but Edith held forth her hand and said, 'Is this indeed farewell?' His heart was agitated, his countenance changed. He retained her hand amid the chattering tourists, too full of their criticisms and their egotistical commonplaces to notice what was passing. A sentimental ebullition seemed to be on the point of taking place. Their eyes met. The look of Edith was mournful and inquiring. 'We will say farewell at the ball,' said Coningsby, and she rewarded him with a radiant smile. Chapter 8. Sidonia lived in the Faubourg Saint Germain, in a large hotel that in old days had belonged to the Crillons, but it had received at his hands such extensive alterations that nothing of the original decoration and little of its arrangement remained. A flight of marble steps, ascending from a vast court, led into a hall of great dimensions, which was at the same time an orangery and a gallery of sculpture. It was illumined by a distinct yet soft and subdued light, which harmonized with the beautiful repose of the surrounding forms, and with the exotic perfume that was wafted about. A gallery led from this hall to an inner hall of quite a different character, fantastic, glittering, variegated, full of strange shapes and dazzling objects. The roof was carved and gilt in that honeycomb style prevalent in the Saracenic buildings. The walls were hung with leather stamped in rich and vivid patterns. The floor was a flood of mosaic. About were statues of negroes of human size, with faces of wild expression, and holding in their outstretched hands silver torches that blazed with an almost painful brilliancy. From this inner hall a double staircase of white marble led to the grand suite of apartments. These saloons, lofty, spacious, and numerous, had been decorated principally in encaustic by the most celebrated artists of Munich. The three principal rooms were only separated from each other by columns, covered with rich hangings, on this night drawn aside. The decoration of each chamber was appropriate to its purpose. On the walls of the ball-room, nymphs and heroes moved in measure in Sicilian landscapes, or on the azure shore of Aegean waters. From the ceiling, beautiful divinities threw garlands on the guests, who seemed surprised that the roses, unwilling to quit Olympus, would not descend on earth. The general effect of this fair chamber was heightened, too, by that regulation of the house which did not permit any benches in the ball-room. That dignified assemblage, who are always found ranged in precise discipline against the wall, did not here mar the flowing grace of the festivity. The chaperons had no cause to complain. A large saloon abounded in ottomans and easy chairs at their service, where their delicate charges might rest when weary, or find distraction when not engaged. All the world were at this fete of Sidonia. It exceeded in splendour and luxury every entertainment that had yet been given. The highest rank, even princes of the blood, beauty, fashion, fame, all assembled in a magnificent and illuminated palace, resounding with exquisite melody. Coningsby, though somewhat depressed, was not insensible to the magic of the scene. Since the passage in the gardens of the Luxembourg, that tone, that glance, he had certainly felt much relieved, happier. And yet, if it all were, with regard to Sidonia, as unfounded as he could possibly desire, where was he then? Had he forgotten his grandfather, that fell look, that voice of intense detestation? What was Millbank to him? What was the mystery? For of some he could not doubt. The Spanish parentage of Edith had only more perplexed Coningsby. It offered no solution. There could be no connection between a Catalan family and his mother, the daughter of a clergyman in a Midland county. That there was any relationship between the Millbank family and his mother was contradicted by the conviction in which he had been brought up, that his mother had no relations; that she returned to England utterly friendless, without a relative, a connection, an acquaintance to whom she could appeal. Her complete forlornness was stamped upon his brain. Tender as were his years when he was separated from her, he could yet recall the very phrases in which she deplored her isolation, and there were numerous passages in her letters which alluded to it. Coningsby had taken occasion to sound the Wallingers on this subject, but he felt assured from the manner in which his advances were met that they knew nothing of his mother, and attributed the hostility of Mr. Millbank to his grandfather solely to political emulation and local rivalries. Still, there were the portrait and the miniature. That was a fact, a clue which ultimately, he was persuaded, must lead to some solution. Coningsby had met with great social success at Paris. He was at once a favourite. The Parisian dames decided in his favour. He was a specimen of the highest style of English beauty, which is popular in France. His air was acknowledged as distinguished. The men also liked him. He had not quite arrived at that age when you make enemies. The moment, therefore, that he found himself in the saloons of Sidonia, he was accosted by many whose notice was flattering, but his eye wandered while he tried to be courteous and attempted to be sprightly. Where was she? He had nearly reached the ball-room when he met her. She was on the arm of Lord Beaumanoir, who had made her acquaintance at Rome, and originally claimed it as a member of a family who, as the reader may perhaps not forget, had experienced some kindnesses from the Millbanks. There were mutual and hearty recognitions between the young men, great explanations where they had been, what they were doing, where they were going. Lord Beaumanoir told Coningsby he had introduced steeplechases at Rome, and had parted with Sunbeam to the nephew of a cardinal. Coningsby securing Edith's hand for the next dance, they all moved on together to her aunt. Lady Wallinger was indulging in some Roman reminiscences with the Marquess. 'And you are not going to Astrakhan to morrow?' said Edith. 'Not to morrow,' said Coningsby. 'You know that you said once that life was too stirring in these days to permit travel to a man?' 'I wish nothing was stirring,' said Coningsby. 'I wish nothing to change. All that I wish is, that this fate should never end.' 'Is it possible that you can be capricious? You perplex me very much.' 'Am I capricious because I dislike change?' 'But Astrakhan!' 'It was the air of the Luxembourg that reminded me of the desert,' said Coningsby. Soon after this Coningsby led Edith to the dance. It was at a ball that he had first met her at Paris, and this led to other reminiscences, all most interesting. Coningsby was perfectly happy. All mysteries, all difficulties, were driven from his recollection. He lived only in the exciting and enjoyable present. 21 and in love. Some time after this Coningsby, who was inevitably separated from Edith, met his host. 'Where have you been, child?' said Sidonia, 'that I have not seen you for some days? I am going to Madrid to morrow.' 'And I must think, I suppose, of Cambridge.' 'Well, you have seen something; you will find it more profitable when you have digested it, and you will have opportunity. That's the true spring of wisdom. Meditate over the past. Adventure and contemplation share our being like night and day.' The resolute departure for England on the morrow had already changed into a supposed necessity of thinking of returning to Cambridge. In fact, Coningsby felt that to quit Paris and Edith was an impossibility. He silenced the remonstrance of his conscience by the expedient of keeping a half term, and had no difficulty in persuading himself that a short delay in taking his degree could not really be of the slightest consequence. It was the hour for supper. The guests at a French ball are not seen to advantage at this period. The custom of separating the sexes for this refreshment, and arranging that the ladies should partake of it by themselves, though originally founded in a feeling of consideration and gallantry, and with the determination to secure, under all circumstances, the convenience and comfort of the fair sex, is really, in its appearance and its consequences, anything but European, and produces a scene which rather reminds one of the harem of a sultan than a hall of chivalry. To judge from the countenances of the favoured fair, they are not themselves particularly pleased, and when their repast is over, they necessarily return to empty halls, and are deprived of the dance at the very moment when they may feel most inclined to participate in its grateful excitement. These somewhat ungracious circumstances, however, were not attendant on the festival of this night. There was opened in the hotel of Sidonia for the first time a banqueting room, which could contain with convenience all the guests. It was a vast chamber of white marble, the golden panels of the walls containing festive sculptures by Schwanthaler, relieved by encaustic tinting. In its centre was a fountain, a group of bacchantes encircling Dionysus, and from this fountain, as from a star, diverged the various tables from which sprang orange trees in fruit and flower. The banquet had but one fault. Coningsby was separated from Edith. The Duchess of Grand Cairo, the beautiful wife of the heir of one of the imperial illustrations, had determined to appropriate Coningsby as her cavalier for the moment. Distracted, he made his escape, but his wandering eye could not find the object of its search, and he fell prisoner to the charming Princess de Petitpois, a Carlist chieftain, whose witty words avenged the cause of fallen dynasties and a cashiered nobility. Behold a scene brilliant in fancy, magnificent in splendour. All the circumstances of his life at this moment were such as acted forcibly on the imagination of Coningsby. Separated from Edith, he had still the delight of seeing her the paragon of that bright company, the consummate being whom he adored, and who had spoken to him in a voice sweeter than a serenade, and had bestowed on him a glance softer than moonlight. The lord of the palace, more distinguished even for his capacity than his boundless treasure, was his chosen friend, gained under circumstances of romantic interest, when the reciprocal influence of their personal qualities was affected by no accessory knowledge of their worldly positions. He himself was in the very bloom of youth and health, the child of a noble house, rich for his present wants, and with a future of considerable fortunes. Entrancing love and dazzling friendship, a high ambition and the pride of knowledge, the consciousness of a great prosperity, the vague, daring energies of the high pulse of 21, all combined to stimulate his sense of existence, which, as he looked round him at the beautiful objects and listened to the delicious sounds, seemed to him a dispensation of almost supernatural ecstasy. About an hour after this the ball room was still full, but the other saloons gradually emptying. Coningsby entered a chamber which seemed deserted. Yet he heard sounds, as it were, of earnest conversation. It was the voice that invited his progress. He advanced another step, then suddenly stopped. There were two individuals in the room by whom he was noticed. They were Sidonia and Miss Millbank. They were sitting on a sofa, Sidonia holding her hand, and endeavouring, as it seemed, to soothe her. Her tones were tremulous, but the expression of her face was fond and confiding. It was all the work of a moment. Coningsby instantly withdrew, yet he could not escape hearing an earnest request from Edith to her companion that he would write to her. In a few seconds Coningsby had quitted the hotel of Sidonia, and the next day found him on his road to England. End of Chapter 8. End of Book 6.